Today my guest is Glenn Block. Glenn, how are you?
How you doing, David?
I'm doing great. Thanks for coming on my show, and thanks for coming to my user group last night. That was a great crowd, great presentation, just a win.
I had an awesome time, and thanks for putting me up at your house so I didn't have to sleep on the street.
Anytime, buddy. You talked about a lot of things, but one of the things was node.js. I want to talk about that because it's really new to me. I mean, I had actually your friend.
You and I both.
Really? Okay. Well, even though you're working,
I've
your day job now, right?
Yeah, I've actually known about Node for since it came out.
Okay.
I first learned about Node when I was attending Uradev in Sweden.
Okay.
About 2 years ago, there was a presentation there about Node, and I was maybe it was a little bit less, maybe it was last year, and I was really impressed with what I saw.
Okay, and we had your friend Mike Amundsen was on the show. He talked about Node and what it is,
right.
But a lot's happened since then. So, like Microsoft is getting involved in it, you're getting involved in it. But first, just quickly, what is Node, or is it Node, or is it Node.js, or is it Node.js?
Both. Well, Node.js is the actual name.
Okay.
It's actually Node.js, but Node is, people just call it Node.
Right. Okay. What's
At the highest level, Node is a server-side JavaScript programming model.
Okay. So if I wanted to build a server application, like a website, for example, or a web service.
Sure, you can do both.
Node is a good example for that.
I can use Node.js for both, yes.
All right. And what is your involvement with Node?
What is my involvement with Node? So Microsoft, a few months back, really about 6 months ago, saw that there wasn't a really good story for Node working on Windows. And the reason for that is because Node was designed to work on top of the Linux/Unix
Sure.
operating system.
Yeah.
So there were a bunch of folks actually for a while who've been using Node on top of Cygwin. And Cygwin, for people that are not familiar with it, is like a shim that makes the Windows operating system appear as like the Linux OS. Now,
okay. All right.
Obviously that's not going to perform as well,
Right.
because it's doing like an adapter type model.
Okay.
So Microsoft, working with Joyent and the Node core team, decided to get involved and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had like a really good story for building Node apps on Windows? And that starts with having a good version of Node that works on Windows.
Okay.
And so we've been actively working with the core team and helping to evolve Node to have a Windows version. Now, we weren't the only ones. There are other people like Bert, who recently did a podcast on Herding Code, who was part of the Node core team and was working on the Windows implementation. But Igor is a Microsoft employee that I work with, and he's actually contributing heavily to the Windows version of Node. So that was how we got involved. We said, let's just start with the base level and make sure there's a good, there's a good story for running Node on Windows.
So that's an interesting relationship. Node is an open source project.
It is.
And you've got Microsoft employees that are contributing to an open source project.
Yes, we do.
It sounds funny just to say that.
It's
I know
amazing.
it's not the first time
actually.
it's happened, but it's not.
I think this is probably one of the most significant, though, the way it's happening. I could get shot for saying that, but I mean, I think what's really interesting here is, this is not about folks from the community contributing in the development of a Microsoft product. This is about Microsoft actively contributing in the development of an open source product.
Right.
And the reason we're doing it is because we see demand. Customers are saying, hey, we like the model of Node, and we'd like to use it on Windows. Maybe I'm in a shop where it's a Windows shop, and I can't, maybe I like some of the elegance of the Node model, but my company's not going to let me use it because of the fact they're a Windows shop.
Okay.
So that's just one.
I get that from the customer side, but explain to me from the Microsoft side. Why does Microsoft care to build another server platform? You've already got IIS.
Sure. Well, we're not building. Again, this is something that people have already gone and built.
Yeah, I said that wrong. You're not building it, but you're still contributing. You're spending money on it.
We are.
Allocating resources
We are.
to something that's a problem that you've already solved.
I think, though, the open source movement is all about choice.
Yeah.
And so, IIS is a choice, and I think, Node is not trying to solve all the problems. Like Node, you can do a really lightweight web server very quickly. Right? IIS gives you permissioning, process management, a whole bunch of other things.
Okay.
That's just not the intent of Node. But on the other hand, I might be building a system where I don't need all of that. So it's really about choice is the way I think about it.
Okay. This is if I wanted to be more agile, if I wanted to get my server applications up and running quicker, Node might be a better choice than something bigger.
Well, I think that Node does some specific things very well.
Okay.
One of the things that's really compelling about Node is the fact that it uses a non-blocking I/O model. So, like in .NET, for example, I can build applications with the new task parallel libraries, or even using like IAsync result that are non-blocking. But the framework fundamentally started off as a sync framework, and it provides abstractions that I can use for doing async.
Okay.
With Node, they started from the ground with the idea that this is going to be built for high throughput and it's going to be non-blocking I/O. So what that means is there's a couple of sync calls actually in the framework, but they're very few. It's like less than a handful.
Okay.
Everything else is completely async. And what that means is that your applications are more responsive, your web apps. They can handle more requests because of the fact that they're not blocking. So one of the things that's really interesting when you look at Node is I say they're more responsive, but it's actually a single-threaded app. Now, for the traditional Microsoft developer, that seems like, how can it actually be responsive if it's single-threaded? That almost sounds like an oxymoron.
Right.
But the reason is because that's coupled with the fact that all the APIs are async. And what happens in Node is you have this model, which Ruby also had with what is known as the event machine, which is this idea that you have an event loop. And what happens is that as requests come in, they queue up,
Okay.
and then there's just a single thread that's just processing things coming off of that. But now let's say that a request comes in and now it executes some code within my application. And now that application has to do something like call out to another service or work with I/O. What it does is it passes a callback. So once it passes that callback is held around, and that callback then goes back onto the event loop. It goes into the queue.
Okay.
Then it's executed. Maybe that callback does something else that requires another callback.
Okay.
It just goes back on the queue. So the advantage of that is that you're continually able to process more and more requests.
Okay.
Whereas if it was a sync model, any one of those things that were being executed might actually be long running. Like I might make a call to a web service, but I didn't do it in an async manner.
Yeah,
so now what happened is I've now blocked. Now in IIS you have lots of different threads, so that doesn't necessarily kill you.
Okay.
But the challenge you get is that when you have to deal with multi-threading, it complicates the programming model. Like anybody who's worked with threading in .NET, it's very powerful. You can do some really cool stuff, but it's not simple. In Node, what's really nice is threading is not a problem because it's not a possibility. Like the APIs don't introduce things like joining threads and thread pools and all this other stuff. So you just write things in an async fashion, and you get these highly responsive applications.
This is interesting because I had a conversation with a fellow named Brian Hunter who's doing a lot of work with Erlang.
Okay.
It sounds a lot like the way he described Erlang.
Yeah, I'm not a pro with Erlang, but I do know that one of the things people say about Erlang is you can have these ultra lightweight like processes. I'm not sure that Erlang has the single event loop.
Okay.
But
I'm not sure.
But I don't know enough about it to know. But I think it's really like a kind of less is more. Now there's a trade-off in doing that because let's say I'm dealing with a multi-core machine. If I'm dealing with a multi-core machine, which means I have multiple processors, well each node.exe is only going to execute in one process.
Okay.
So even if I have 16 processors, I'm only going to take advantage of one. That is without doing anything extra. Okay. And there are things you can do to do that. Because what you can do is you can spawn multiple instances of node.exe.
Okay.
What's actually interesting about that is then the programming model is still very simplified because I haven't introduced for example in .NET we can do like multi-core and it's actually really cool stuff. But it means now, and we've made it really simple I think with like the parallel extensions. Like you can do, recently my coworker Paul Badham and Scott Hanselman, co-workers, presented at this Keeping It Real Time conference, and they showed how using the parallel extensions you could do like a parallel 4, and you could literally like spawn off and take advantage of multiple processors to process a large task. And that's really impressive. Under the hood, before the TPL, that was really hard to do. You had to launch threads, spawn them.
Right.
TPL made that easier. In this model with Node, the way I would do that is I would launch multiple node.exes, which is a bit more work.
Right.
In the latest version of Node, Node.6, they introduced this thing called cluster. And cluster is a way that allows me to say, hey, I have a node process, but I want to spin up others to solve a problem, and I can message between them.
Okay.
But it's still more work. It's doable, but it's more work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Let me ask you one last question. So, if I am building applications for IIS and deploying ASP.NET applications or web services, should I be all of a sudden changing my focus? Is that the message? Should I be working towards Node, or is it should I be?
I think
what should I be thinking?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question because a lot of people will ask, like, oh, is this another, like Microsoft was doing Silverlight and then HTML5, is this now like Microsoft is saying?
I get that it's a choice.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to rationalize that choice in my mind.
Right, so I think that Node does a set of, so there's a couple of different things. I think one, if you're a developer who, develops not on Windows today, and you really like the Node model, and now you're in an environment where there's Windows, we're saying, hey, you'll have a good story for doing that. That's first. Okay. If I already develop on Windows and I'm a .NET developer or, I develop with the Microsoft stack, you don't need to go to Node. We're not telling you like you have to go.
Right.
There may be places where there are interesting hybrids. One of the things we mentioned, like Node does really well for processing like large numbers of requests that come in and being able to just siphon those off. Okay. So there are people that are looking at just injecting little pieces of Node. When I was at Keeping It Real-Time conference, I talked to a gentleman that was doing that, where he's like, look, most of our app is all in .NET, but we have to do this stuff with RabbitMQ, where we need something that just like reads stuff from the queue and then just makes a call. Okay. And we found that Node was really, really good for doing that. Like the queue's filling up really fast, it's checking the queue, pulling stuff off, and going and doing something. So I think you'll find interesting places where people may say, ooh, Node solves a problem for me, that maybe it's not as nice to handle that, let's say with the .NET framework. It's possible, but it's nicer with Node, I'll use it. The other thing that I think people will be attracted to is that Node has a really rich ecosystem of modules. You get to a lot of choice, which is a pro and a con. Some people don't want all those choices, other people do. I think people that like the choices of saying I can literally like build up the stack that I want, there's some attraction there for using Node to do that. Okay. I do want to plug one thing though before we get off about IIS. Yeah. So I mentioned this thing about how node.exe, if I want to deal with multi-core, I don't have a great story for doing that in Node. Right? Now there is this library called Nginx, which a lot of people use in Unix and Linux, which does allow you to spawn off multiple things. It doesn't work for Windows. But one of the things that's really interesting is we integrated with Node with IIS. And there's a project out there called IIS Node that you can get right now. It's on GitHub. Just search for IIS Node. And what IIS Node brings to the table is process management above Node. Like a lot of people feel when you say, oh, Node and IIS, it sounds like, why would I ever do that? Right. But one of the really cool things about IIS is IIS can say, based on load, I will spin up multiple instances of a thing. So with IIS Node, what can happen is I can actually take advantage of multi-core because IIS Node will spin up those different Node exe instances, and you'll get fault tolerance because if one of them locks up, IIS Node can just kill it and spin up another one. So that's one of the attractions about the work we're doing with IIS Node, is that we're making it so that it's easier for you to just, deploy a Node app on Windows and to gain those process management benefits. One other thing we're doing also is, one problem people get into when they start to work with Node is, how do I debug my app? Okay. So there's a really cool library called
JavaScript, though. That's why it's Node.js.
Exactly. There's a really cool library, and Node builds on top of the Google V8 engine. So it's really like a layer on top of Google's JavaScript engine, and they're using it on the server. There's this library called Node Inspector, and Node Inspector is a debugger in the browser. It's really pretty sweet. It's a HTML5, really rich application. Okay. With IIS Node, we're making it so if you want to use Node Inspector, Today, if I use Node Inspector myself, and I've done this, there's a bunch of manual stuff I have to do. First, it wasn't working very well on Windows. But second, I have to manually spin up this separate Node exe process, which is handling Node Inspector. And I've got to open a bunch of browsers and do a bunch of stuff. And I'll do it if I have no other choice.
Right.
With IIS Node, we just magically do that for you. You can enable it so that I can just go to a URL and do /debug. Up comes Node Inspector. And then I can go to my URL and just put breakpoints,
You do this
watches.
on the server or on the client?
Well, server client is blurred, right?
Okay.
It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
The other piece I wanted to mention about why we're interested in making Node work on Windows is we want Node to work in Azure. And so another thing that we're doing, which you'll be hearing about more and more, is we're taking the work that we're doing of enabling Node on Windows and we're saying, okay, let's make it now so I can deploy a Node application that I've built on Windows to Azure.
Nice.
Or even deploy an application that I haven't built on Windows to Azure.
Very nice.
So it's a very broad...
And there are PowerShell scripts to assist it as well, right?
That was stuff we demoed last night. Yeah, the PowerShell obviously is not going to be interested to folks that are not on Windows.
Okay.
But very interesting, we think, to folks in Windows because PowerShell offers a scripting experience that's on par with like Bash and these other shell scripting environments for Linux or Unix. But what I can say, if it's not already out there, is that is coming. We will have a story for allowing me to say, write a Node app on a Mac and get it up there in the cloud.
Okay. So
that's TBD.
There's a lot going on right now. It's
There
moving
is.
very quickly.
There is.
Where can we follow the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. You could keep, the best place right now is to keep track of Tomik Janshuk's GitHub site.
Okay, I'll spell that out somewhere.
Yeah. You can also watch my blog. There'll be more and more stuff coming on my blog, codebetter.com/Glenn Block. And so the other thing I wanted to mention, by the way, is we're doing something around Azure and Node which you'll be able to benefit from even if you're not deploying to Azure or building on Windows. And what that is Azure is more than just like hosting of applications like, say, Heroku. Azure offers services like blob storage and table store and service bus and all this other stuff. And we're happy to announce that we're going to be publishing an Azure module in NPM, which is the Node Package Manager registry.
Okay.
And that's going to allow me to say, like, even if I've got a Node app that's running on Heroku, but if I want to access some of the Azure services like Table Store, I can do it.
Okay.
So we really got a very broad perspective. And then the last plug I'll make, and I always have one more to say, is we're also doing some tooling for Windows with WebMatrix. And I demoed that last night. WebMatrix is a really lightweight IDE. You don't have to use it if you don't want to, but we're making it so it has like JavaScript IntelliSense, templates for getting going with Node on IIS Node. So there's a lot of cool stuff that we're doing in this space.
Outstanding. Glenn Block, thank you so much.
It's great to finally be on your show, David. I know I've pinged you a few times and said, I'd love to be on your show one of these days.
Begging to get on this show. I'm just kidding. It's an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here.